Hello, everyone. Hello, Texas, Hollywood, Newcastle, Geelong, Cronulla, Florida, Gosford, Birch Grove, Canberra, Margaret River. Hi, everyone. It's a very windy day in Sydney. You may every now and then hear the wind in the background. And this is exciting. It's our first advanced webinar in a few months, and it's about one of my favorite topics. Before we start, I just wanted to make sure you can hear me. Can you all hear me? That's always the challenge at the beginning of these webinars. Is the microphone connecting through properly? Or at least this? Yes, good, excellent. It means we can get started. All right, so how's this going to work? I'm going to do some screen sharing here. Yeah. And, all right, hang on. So, as I indicated when I launched the email, POV is a ridiculously important topic. And I'm very pleased to see over 50 people online now, and 59 actually still going up. So you probably understand that you can learn something from this session. Now, this is going to be a compact session, a condensed session of a class I normally teach over the course of a whole day. POV is one of three issues that I consider being the main culprits of films that don't work or scripts that don't work in the first place. It's a poor premise, that's concept, problematic POV, that's what we talk about today, and passive protagonist. Sometimes they hang together, and people are familiar with my approach of character events and actions, understand how that is all integrated. I did a webinar on that a few months ago, and you can still find it in our little shop of webinars. Now, this webinar is also available as a podcast on iTunes, so I apologize in advance for those who are listening. You may miss out because obviously you can't see the slides, and there will be some video material in the course of this webinar as well. So what are we going to do today? We're going to talk about point of view and look at a number of aspects of POV. You'll be surprised how many aspects there are to it, how you can approach it, how you can manage it, how you can control it, and how you can go miserably wrong. So there are two types of point of view I'll indicate. I'll explain why it's so important. We'll talk about point of view in other art forms. Point of view in adaptation, that's a big one. Exceptions to the rules. I'm not going to invite you to follow those blindly, obviously. I'll show you a beautiful POV failure. I'll mention, if you have time, something about POV cheating. Most importantly, I'll tell you how to control it, how to manage POV in your screenplay. We'll say something, an anecdote about Michael Haig's mistake in a Sydney workshop. I'll explain shifting POV. That's an important skill to master, because ultimately that's really what it comes down to. Pixar use point of view to their benefit, and I'll also show you how Brad Bird learned a thing or two about POV. There's an ebook, and I'll offer that ebook at the end of this webinar. It goes a little bit deeper into what I'll be discussing, and it'll cover a few more things as well. Obviously, there'll be question time, and I'll also say a few words about the immersion screenwriting course. Some of you are doing that right now, and others may be interested in taking that course in the future. So, you may have read in a screenplay, or you may have written in a screenplay something along the lines of this: POV Jack, and then you describe what Jack sees. Jack is our main character. Now, most of the time when I read this, it's actually unnecessary, because you'll learn, if you pay attention, if you really study POV, you'll see that most stories are told from the POV of the main character throughout. So there's no need to specify that. There are situations where you must, specifically when To make that moment work, to make that scene work, you shift out of the POV of of the main character into another character, and you want the camera to take the place of the eyes of that character. But typically, there's no need to do this because you'll always have the point of view of the main character. That brings us to a distinction between two types of POV. When you write this in a screenplay, POV the monster, for instance, we effectively mean camera point of view. The camera will take the place of the eyes of that character. The second type of POV is dramatic point of view, and that's what we'll be talking about today. That is what concerns us the most, and that's what we need to be aware of 99% of the time. Now, years ago, to be precise, in the 1940s, 1947, Warner Brothers made an amazing discovery. They found a way of engaging the audience more than ever before, and it was a truly revolutionary breakthrough, similar to the introduction of sound in movies, or the moving camera, or if you want to look at today's films, 3D. Now, 3D is maybe a bit more of a hype, and maybe that camera point of view idea was a little bit of a hype back then as well. Let's have some fun and go back to a trailer for Lady in the Lake from 1947, where point of view suddenly becomes a selling point. At least that's what they thought. C. Lady in the Lake, 1947. Warner Brothers got it almost right, but not quite. In fact, they did understand one thing really well. They got it that an audience needs to identify with the main character. What they didn't understand at the time, the fundamental mistake, was that identification doesn't happen through camera point of view. In fact, it happens through dramatic point of view. And dramatic point of view is very different. And we'll talk about the specific techniques to make that happen in a minute. So how do we define dramatic point of view? Different people define it in different ways. I'd say it's the character through whose perspective the story is viewed. So that's the point of view character. So when we speak about point of view, it can be a character, or it could be the set of tools that you're learning during this hour, during this webinar. A set of techniques used to keep the screen audience identified with a character. So the tool that Warner Brothers tried to use was camera point of view, and that is not the way to do it. We'll get to how in a minute. But first of all, why should we care? Why is that identification so important? Why should we worry about point of view? Well, think about it. Today we're talking primarily about cinematic point of view, film, theatrical film. And the experience is very much like a dream. You know, we go into a dark place and we are experiencing a story that is effectively fictitious. It's not happening at this particular point in time, but at some point we forget that we are sitting in that theater and we become part of the story. It's almost one-on-one identification with that main character. That's when stories are the strongest, when we have a simulated experience, when we feel the emotions that the character is supposed to feel. And that can only be from one perspective. And when you dream, you only ever dream from your perspective. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to that rule, or inceptions. Here's what I would say is the reason why POV identification is important in cinema. So because of the nature of cinema, the audience forgets where they are, even who they are. Sitting in the dark, and for the duration of the film, they become the characters on the screen. That's when point of view works. And it's your job as the writer to try and achieve that. Now, Robert McKee said something about point of view as well, and in his book Story. Not a lot. He doesn't spend a lot of, in fact, no one really has spent sufficient attention on POV. So that's why I think it's important you do your study yourself. McKee says the more time spent with a character, the more opportunity to witness his choices. The result is more empathy and emotional involvement between audience and character. You can watch the replay later, by the way, so you don't need to take notes from everything you get to see here. So that's Robert McKee's perspective. Now, let's look at how point of view works in different art forms, because today we speak about film. Television is slightly different because you have more time in TV series to elaborate on a character. You can go to other characters and still have enough depth of involvement and depth of identification. But think about it. Still, many of the really successful TV shows are told primarily from a single perspective. You know, Dexter, Breaking Bad, Mad Men. And it's only when you've created that engagement and you've created suspense and you have that undercurrent of tension that you can go to another character, and mostly that is only for a limited period of time. But as I said, in television, you have greater freedom there. In literature, you probably have the greatest freedom. If you think about what types of point of view you'll find, there's obviously the first person, which is the strongest. That's when we identify. It's our story. It's as if the story happens to me, and the main character of the story tells that story directly to us. So that's the closest involvement. In literature, as in film, you have first person as the most powerful one. Second person is almost non-existent. In my classes, I play clip. I do the quiz. What art form uses second person more than any other? It's songs. It's love songs. Love songs are directed to the second person. Third person is more common in literature, fiction, not so much in film. It does exist, when you have a narrator telling the story about our main character. But very often we go back to the main character to identify in the first person. Now, third person omniscient, I'm not going into this. That's something you should read in the ebook. It's non-existent, and I will briefly touch on it in the context of my Michael Haig anecdote and Die Hard. But if anyone tells you that their story is omniscient, then please ignore that, because they don't know what they're talking about. Shifting point of view, that's what you need to be aware of, because that's the technique that allows you to go from one character to the next, and then we will identify with that next character in the first person. Now, while you watch a presentation, feel free to post questions. And I see that some people already have. The best way to do it is to use the question option. So in the chat frame at the bottom of your page, you can just post a message or ask a question. If you select where this is a text bubble, you see a little triangle. If you click on that, you have the option to ask questions. If you have trouble with your connection, with your bandwidth, you can do two things. You can reconnect, just reset at the bottom of your page there in the center. There should be an option to do that. Or you can just wait for the replay, and that usually goes smoother. And ask the question, how can you address the problem of a passive protagonist? Passive protagonist is unrelated to point of view. It is completely, well, it's unrelated in the sense that when you have a passive protagonist, you'll be more inclined to move out of the point of view of that character, simply because that character is no longer very interesting. But it is a separate issue altogether. So shifting point of view is the most interesting one, and we'll talk about that. And then finally, there is this really bizarre. So first, dramatic irony. That's an example of shifting point of view. But then finally, I call it the Kaufman point of view. Charlie Kaufman, he plays with point of view in Being John Malkovich. And the title suggests, John Cusack's character becomes John Malkovich. And we shift from Cusack to the character of Malkovich, and then there's a few other characters he keeps shifting effectively, and where we end up. That's when some people may lose the story, or Kaufman may lose his audience. We'll have a look what happens in that film. It's Charlie Kaufman's Being John Malkovich, and he plays with point of view to the point where it becomes quite absurd. Some people will go with it, others won't. Be aware of that. And ask the question, the point of view of the story should be that of the protagonist, but can it also be the POV of the antagonist? And what about multi-POV in a story when multiple characters drive the theme of the story? Good question. And I think at the end of this webinar, you will have the answer to that. The short response would be, if you were to take the point of view of the protagonist, you are in art house territory. I have an example where that happens, but it's very unusual, and you will reduce your audience. You will significantly limit your audience. Multi-POV doesn't work quite as well, and I would call it shifting POV, because multiple point of view is impossible. You cannot at the same time be in the POV of more than one character. So if you look at a film like Crash, that is an exception. There's only one Oscar winner who's ever achieved that. And don't forget, Paul Haggis had 20 years of experience in television before he wrote that screenplay. And in television, shifting POV is quite common. So that's the brief answer. Adaptation. Now, I'm not talking about the movie by Charlie Kaufman, or written by Charlie Kaufman, but we'll get to that one later. What if you adapt a book, a novel that is written from several perspectives? And maybe that is Anne's question, or part of Anne's question. If you want to tell a multi-protagonist story or a multi-protagonist novel, you want to bring that to the screen, the sanest thing to do would be to pick one perspective and tell that story, retell that story from one point of view. And that's what the greatest adaptations have always done. The greatest screenwriters do that, and do that quite well. If you look at a few titles, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was effectively told from the chief's perspective, but that was difficult because we could go into his thoughts in the novel, but the same cannot be achieved on the screen, and therefore Milos Forman chose to tell the story from McMurphy's perspective. And then obviously in the frame story, we come back. That was very successful. Another really successful adaptation was Room with a View. Room with a View, the Forster novel from the late 1800s, I believe, early 1900s. Adapted by Merchant Ivory. The screenwriter was Ruth Broad-Jabvala, wonderful screenwriter and quite an expert at literary adaptations. I have a page from the novel here, and let's just have a quick look at that to see what the point of view is on this particular page. At that supreme moment, he was conscious of nothing but absurdities. Just the phrase "he was conscious" places us in the point of view of the male character, which is Sybil. She gave such a businesslike lift to her veil as he approached her. He found time to wish. Again, firmly in his point of view. Further down, he considered, he recast the scene, he believed that women revere men for their manliness. Is that true? So this page is undeniably from Sybil's point of view. Now, those who've seen the film know that The Room with a View is told from perspective of Lucy Honeychurch, and her single point of view. This particular scene, by the way, the Sacred Lake, it's called, we get the confirmation of that point of view when there's a short flashback, and flashbacks are the clearest among some. Dreams is another one, or voiceover, the clearest indication whose point of view we are in. So when you have a flashback in your story, do make sure that is done from the main character's perspective. I'll give you an example of where someone went wrong and did it from a different perspective, and that didn't quite work. I know we're screenwriters. We want to be creative. We want to be different. We don't want to do the way people did it before. So we want to break rules. And for that, we will always argue that there are films that did it differently and did it successfully. And you're absolutely right. There are very successful exceptions. Here's a few. Sicario recently was an interesting point of view. It started from Emily Blunt's perspective and then shifted to Benicio del Toro's. I would argue that to tell that same story, you could not stay in either's perspective throughout the film. So you need to make a decision. If that's your story, you're going to either massacre the story, or tell a different story, or limit your audience, because some people will not like that. Some people will find that they've invested in this one character, and now suddenly we're going to leave that character behind, going to a different character. So if you want to tell a story that requires you to shift in the course of the story the main perspective, then that's a different call to make. I think The Prestige was one like that. Movie started from Hugh Jackman's perspective and then gradually shifted to Christian Bale's. At least that was how I experienced it. Shawshank Redemption is slightly different in that you have somewhat of a dual perspective. We shift back and forth. One character has what we call the inner journey. That's Red, who learns, and Andy Dufresne, played by Tim Robbins, he is the outer journey hero. He's the character who drives the action. Animal Kingdom, I would also categorize as a film that is an exception in terms of point of view, because we leave Jay's perspective at a critical moment, which is the inciting incident. And some people will argue that that worked really well. I love the movie, but I do believe that if that story had been told more rigorously from Jay's perspective, it would have been more powerful. But that was probably not Michaud's objective. I put Psycho at the bottom of the list because that's a wonderful exception where, yes, we do shift into the point of view of the antagonist. And you remember what a profound impact that had on the audience. It's extraordinary, it's exceptional, and it's not something you should replicate because it worked for this movie because Hitchcock was doing something really interesting. He was telling the story of a paranoid schizophrenic character, and what he really did with the audience was give us that experience. We identified first with Marion Crane, Jenna Lee's character, and then when she was no longer around, we were forced to pick the only character on the screen, and that was Norman Bates. So we had to go with Norman Bates at that particular point in time. And then later in that story, we keep shifting. We go to the detective. So there are exceptions. Some of these exceptions are quite successful, but do acknowledge that they are exceptions indeed. You know, it's not something that you should replicate. And as I said, there are stories where you can only do that, but I would say get some experience first. See your stories on the screen before you play with it. David asks, in a buddy movie like Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, it's usually two POVs. Now, buddy movies, love stories have that. Sleeping in Seattle, we go back and forth. So love stories essentially have not just a dual POV or a shifting POV because you go back and forth, but also a dual protagonist. They're hard to write. They're gruesomely hard to write, and they're not the type of stories I would recommend to beginning screenwriters because you need to achieve a similar level of involvement and identification with each character. You have only half of the time. Not easy. That's that scene in Psycho where we see the car go down into the swamp and then stop. Norman Bates wants to get rid of the evidence, but then the car doesn't disappear and he worries, and we feel his fear and we want it to disappear with him. So we are at that point identified with the antagonist. So, and it is possible, but these instances are quite exceptional. Interesting failures. And to show you one, I need to change my presentation here. And while I do that, I'll play another interesting point of view clip. Let's see which one. I've got a few videos lined up here. Yes, I spoke about Charlie Kaufman and adaptation, and I'm now running ahead on one of the techniques to place your audience firmly in the POV of the character. Let me be clear, this is not a failure, although Robert McKee says you should not use voiceover because it's lazy screenwriting. This is definitely not a failure. It's Okay, that was shorter than I'd expected. Um, I was just lining up the rest of the presentation, and we're going to the techniques that you use for, in fact, to keep your audience into the or in the POV of your main character. And after that, we'll go to shifting POV. Our failures, of course, that's where we were. Let's look at an interesting failure. In fact, when I prepared for this webinar quite a while ago, as you do, you Google. And I Googled this phrase, film, same story from different perspective. And that's what you wanted, isn't it? So what did Google give me? It gave me Vantage Point. And there's a little review of that film. And I want to share that with you. Here we go. So maybe you should hold off on that idea of multiple point of view for just a while and focus on your single point of view. The techniques, they're quite simple, and they're, oh yeah, sorry, if you couldn't read the type, Rain, I'd say watch the replay. It's worth it. The techniques are quite simple, but it requires discipline. And the first one, this is the most important one, keep your main character on the screen. That's the number one thing. They must be in the scene, they must be on the screen. Why do they need to be on the screen? Because we need to see their eyes. And that was the big mistake Warner made in 1947 with Lady in the Lake. When you do a camera point of view, you cannot see the eyes of that character. It's absolutely critical. And it sounds counterintuitive, because if you want to experience something, you want to see what that character sees. In film, it is different. In film, you need to see the eyes of that character. It's much, much more powerful than camera point of view. So I say those two, stick to those two, and you're halfway there. So keep your character on the screen and make sure we see their eyes, so we understand their reaction to every story beat. We also need to understand their goals. It turns out that we are all goal-oriented people, creatures, and we identify more easily with a character that has goals, that has clear goals, that has strong goals. So if you have your goals clearly defined, and that is an essential point for screenwriting anyway, that will help the identification. Secrets is another one. If we share a secret with a character, the identification is going to be much easier. Put the character in jeopardy, it'll be easy to feel the fear, to feel the suspense through the point of view, through the perspective of that character. Now, questions, I should put as number 3, really, because questions are super powerful. When a movie opens, we have questions. We have questions about the world. We have questions about the characters. When these characters on the screen express those questions for us, we identify with them. And the immersion screenwriting students know if they, I forgot which screenplay it was, I'll look that up quickly. One of the scripts had a question. It's script number 6 in the screenwriting, in the immersion screenwriting course, has a question about just this. And I'll give the answer if you're not to script 6 yet and you're on this webinar. Well, the question was, the main character, the lines of the 50 or more than 50% of the lines of the main character in that movie are something, and they're all questions. And I won't give away which movie it is. It's a big movie, but you can probably Google that again. So in big movies, a lot of the lines of the main characters are questions. Now, there can be another aspect to that. In Inception, Nolan made a decision to move away from the character of Don Cobb and have the questions, the expositionary questions, asked by a supporting character. I didn't think that was very effective because we felt the connection with Don Cobb slipping, and we went into the point of view of Emma Page's character, Ariadne. That's how powerful questions are. They force us in the point of view of that character. So have that character ask the questions that we, the audience, have, and you will manage to keep us or get us into that point of view. And then finally, you saw the example from Adaptation. Voiceover is another super powerful way of creating identification with a character. So that's these are the techniques. I wanted to tell a bit about shifting POV because you won't stick to my advice and you will want to go to the point of view of a different character. Okay, I'll help you to understand when and where you can do that. There's really three main reasons why you would do that. First one is mystery. It's not necessarily the biggest one or the most important one. If you want to create a sense of mystery or uncertainty about what you see is real or not, you can shift to an unreliable character. In the murder mystery Laura, there's a whole sequence told from the perspective of one of the suspects. He tells the story. We go into his point of view. We stay in his point of view. We experience what he tells the detective as if we were experiencing it. But we don't know whether it actually happened. So there's mystery there. More importantly, dramatic irony. It's used all the time. In short moments in every film, we move away briefly from the main character to get information that has an impact on our main character, that puts our main character in jeopardy. Usually, often it's about danger. We see a hidden gun, or we see a letter, or we see a piece of information that the main character doesn't have, but that we have, the audience. So when you have a discrepancy between what we know and what the main character knows, we call that dramatic irony. It's a term coined by Frank Daniel. And finally, comedy. I would say almost every comedic moment in a film, if it's not a line of dialogue, if the comedy is not in the dialogue, if it's a situation, there will be a third person looking at the two characters between who that situation plays out. John Cleese defined comedy as not two people doing funny things, or not us looking at people doing funny things, but it is somebody looking at somebody doing something funny. I'm very bad at paraphrasing here, but if you want the proper definition, go to Steve Kaplan. His book, The Hidden Tools of Comedy, dedicates a whole chapter to what he calls the straight line, wavy line. Now, I do have a little clip, and it's probably my favorite example of today, and I'm praying that YouTube will allow me to play it, because I've uploaded these clips to YouTube and sometimes they're blocked for reasons of copyright, but most studios allow you to play it as long as you let commercials play out. So you should see it without commercial. There's examples from 3 movies. I'll quickly introduce them. First one is Stranger Than Fiction, an example of third-person narrative. So third-person, not really point of view. The film opens with the narration by Emma Thompson, and she tells the story of Harold Crick, and he is the main character. So soon after that, we go into his point of view. Now, the scene you're going to see is an example of shifting point of view for comedy. He will be talking to the writer, to God in the sky. And we understand that because the whole film has followed that concept that his story is being written as the movie plays out. That is not funny in itself. But when we have other characters look at it, other characters see him behave this way, then it becomes funny. My students know I've also played the clip from The Incredibles quite a bit. End of The Incredibles, Dash has now learned to control his running, his speeding, and he's running a race, and his parents are yelling at him to become second, not first, to run to become second. And there's this guy sitting next to them who doesn't quite understand what's going on. We get it. We totally get what's going on because we've seen the story. But this guy doesn't get it. So it's funny. And you'll see how we cut back to that point of view. It's a shifting point of view, brief shifting point of view to create that comedy. And the last example, if you think This is the best example of shifting point of view. You might guess which one that will be. Here we go. That moment in When Harry Met Sally only works because we shift to that other woman. And that's where the comedy comes in. So shifting point of view to create comedy, to create dramatic irony, and to create mystery. Dramatic irony can be summarized in one sentence, in fact. We've seen these: mystery, dramatic irony, comedy. Dramatic irony is when you read little did he know, because we know, the reader knows, the viewer knows, but the character does not. Let's go to Pixar. If you want to learn about storytelling, go to Pixar, see how they do things. Michael Arndt spoke about point of view when they were working on Toy Story 3. He had a problem introducing the inciting incident. And in this little clip, he explains how he used point of view to solve that problem. Now, again, my warning, my typical warning, don't try this at home, because these guys are experienced. Is another example of shifting point of view. And we're back. I've been keeping an eye on the questions and your chat. Yeah. Simon says, Michael Arndt is king. Absolutely. And Les says, don't tell us not to try it at home. We should try it, so we find out how to do it properly. The problem with that is that you only see it when when it's on the screen. You only know whether it works or not. That's just the thing. Your own material, it's very hard to judge it on the page. You need to see it play out on the screen to understand how and whether it works. I have another example from Pixar, and this is one of my favorites. And it's, it shows again how much you can learn from looking at director's commentary. This one is from Brad Bird. He is an outstanding filmmaker. Well, until he did what was it, Tomorrowland, but he's got a quite impressive track record, ranging back from the Simpsons to the Iron Giant, Ratatouille, The Incredibles. He also did one of the Mission Impossible movies. Now he understands story and he's learned things the hard way. Well, maybe he was protected by the studio. I'll show you two deleted scenes from two different films he made with an interval of 8 years. The Iron Giant was his first directorial animated feature, and he had to cut a scene. The studio, Warner Brothers, didn't want to animate the scene of the giant's dream. And it makes sense because the story is not the giant's story. It's the story of Hogarth. Hogarth is the point of view character. So by definition, you shouldn't go into the point of view of the giant. Now they had figured their way around it, but that sort of workarounds don't always work. And Warner Brothers didn't want to run the risk, and I think they were absolutely right. Now, 8 years later, Brad Bird had learned, and in his next animation, the Ratatouille was not his next. He did Crabs in the meantime, but he had learned about point of view, and he explains why he cut out a scene this time around. So it was not the studio. He decided to take it out himself. So first, you'll hear him talk about that scene that was cut out of the Iron Giant. Is a little bit bitter about it, and then we see just a small part of the scene from Ratatouille that never made it into the film, and then you'll hear his commentary, and he explains why he cut that out. It is so worth checking out those director's commentaries or writer's commentaries. I really, really recommend, if you want to learn about filmmaking, check out deleted scenes. In fact, I did a little bit of research on that as well, and some of you may know or like the TV series Mr. Robot. And if you look at the deleted scenes in the first season, I think there's only 2 that are made available, and one of them is not from the point of view of the main character. So even in television, every now and then, the filmmakers or the producers decide to take out scenes that are not clearly focused from the main character's perspective. Good, we're rapidly approaching the end of this webinar. And yep, I'm going to have to leave the anecdote about Michael Haig for another time. You could read that in the ebook. I'll say a few things about that in a minute. Now, before we finish, make sure you post your questions. I'm going to look at your questions in a second. I have mentioned that ebook a couple of times. I always give something special to the attendance of my live webinars, and I wanted to offer you not just the ebook, but the ebook together with the webinar, the premium version of the webinar, which will be available in the little shop of webinars, where things rapidly increase in price. If you go there, you look at previous webinars, they're all around $39 to $79. This one will soon be there for $39. I'm offering it to you for $9. So if you want to pre-order the full pack, you can get it now for $9 only. What's the premium webinar? Well, when you saw me look away from the camera, I was actually looking into a slightly higher resolution camera. So I do a proper edit of this webinar afterwards and upload that, and you can access that as part of this pack that you can get now for $9, later for $39, and some of these go up to $79, as I said. If you're interested in other webinars, I'll post a link to those in the next email. So let's have a look at the questions. Where are we? Yes. Questions. Lois says, adapting a story with time travel and 9 main characters, I should maybe leave for a while. Lois, nothing to worry. You are a television writer. Time travel and 9 main characters, perfectly possible, but it's got to go on television. And just instead of making 2 hours, make it 50 hours or 200 hours. Remember Battlestar Galactica? Marina says, oh man, I'm sure this is a hugely basic question. How is POV shown in a screenplay? By showing what the main character is doing. No, Marina, this is a brilliant question. In fact, I should have addressed it, and I was planning on addressing it. So thank you for reminding me. How do you address POV in a screenplay? Well, you just start the sentence with the name of your main character. I did an exercise in reverse screenwriting, and the immersion students will know very soon what reverse screenwriting is, as that's the second stage of that course. Reverse screenwriting is when you write an existing scene into a screenplay. So rather than, having a script and making the movie's made, you're going to write the script. I did this exercise, and one of the students, I took the midpoint of Avatar. One of the students wrote, Colonel Quaritch does this, Colonel Quaritch does that, and he described the whole scene from the perspective of Quaritch. Now, Jake is the main character in Avatar, and in the screenplay, James Cameron started each sentence with that. Jake can't look at his eyes or something, averts his gaze. So you just focus on the main character and tell the story in the active tense, using your main character as the subject of your sentence. That's how you usually do it. Christina says there were different points of view in Stranger Things. Is that because it's television? Absolutely. It is TV, and in Stranger Things, there are a number of characters that all compete for equal prominence, I would say. David says, Fight Club must have been complicated in POV matters. Oh, yes. Fight Club's definitely one of those exceptions, also because the story is exactly about that. It is about that schizophrenic main character. Good. So Anne came back on the topic of passive protagonist, and I think that's good because passive protagonist was one of those key 3 issues, if you remember. If one of the problems with POV is a passive protagonist, how can you fix that so that the audience can identify with the POV of the main character? Yeah. Give your character goals. Make sure they are pursuing those goals. They're struggling to achieve those goals. And that's usually in Act 2. And it's usually in Act 2 when the writer doesn't know how to keep focus on that main character and then shifts to another character. So it's about keeping your character on the screen, giving them enough to do. And in Canberra for the Accelerator Pod program, I did a session where I mentioned that your main character ideally should be obsessive. If your character is obsessive by nature, they will be active. And we will want to be with them. And we will want to feel the adrenaline. We will want to be with them as they struggle to achieve their goals. See if there are any other questions. I'm really only looking at the questions in red on my screen. They're the ones that you've entered separately. I see the other message, but there's so many of them, so it's really tough to find if there's any other questions in there. So Katara says something. Oh, no, that was Tulois. Okay. David says, as Brett mentioned, it could be the main character or another character. It just has to be someone's, as opposed to just an interesting camera move. Yeah, well, David, it was in the case of Ratatouille, it was the main character, and it was not by coincidence that it was the main character. You'll find that most stories are told primarily from the main character. But you're right. You can shift. You cannot have an omniscient point of view because that robs us from emotional engagement. Good. All right. Victor has a question. Oh, Christina says, suddenly there's a whole lot of questions. Qatar, has a shifting point of view already been done in a biopic? Interesting one. Well, if you have a biopic, I would expect to stay with that character that you're telling the story about. But you would shift it. All right, here we're going to wrap up very quickly. But there's one thing that I want to mention is that if you want to know when you can shift, it's usually right after a climax, when there is enough tension to keep the audience engaged and wanting to know what's going to happen next. Study One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and North by Northwest. Both films are told rigorously from the perspective of from the main character. But there are only 1 or 2 moments in the entire film when we shift away from that point of view. And in the case of North by Northwest, that's at the end of Act 1, beginning of Act 2. In One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that is right after the midpoint. So at the beginning of sequences, at the beginning of acts, very briefly, one brief scene at the very most. Victor asks, can you do a webinar on developing a solid premise? Very good one, Victor. I will do that. And in fact, I've been planning on doing that. I've been gathering material. I have a class. I have a whole weekend on concepts. In fact, I've mentioned the Accelerator Pod in Canberra a few times. That's really what that program is all about. It's about developing solid concepts, solid premises. Sally, that's a final question. Sally, how do you have one person as a narrator and another as the protagonist? How to handle the POV? Good. Well, in fact, the protagonist will be the main POV. Narrator is rarely an interesting point of view because the story is about the first person character, and we want to experience what that person experiences. So the experiences of the narrator are rarely interesting. Therefore, in the Prestige, when the Prestige opens with a point of view of the Michael Caine character, the narrator, we very quickly go into Hugh Jackman's character. When Strange Nonfiction opens with Emma Thompson's voice as the narrator, very quickly we go into Harold Crick. So you have a frame story where the narrator talks, but then the dramatic point of view very quickly becomes the protagonist, single first-person protagonist. I hope that answers your question, Sally. Good. Immersion, we don't have much time left. In fact, we have no time left. But what I'll do is I will post a link. If you want to know what immersion is about, there is a Facebook group, a closed Facebook group, where you can hang out and ask questions and talk with current students. And I'm hoping, I said that I would not do another free immersion course again, but I'm still planning on doing one, because we want to make sure that everything's ironed out before we start the paid courses in 2017. So the chances are that we start another immersion free group on the 1st of November. And I will post the link to that closed group right now. And that should be in the right-hand side of your, yeah, there we go. Join immersion for free. That's it. You'll have that before I say it, because there's a 30-second delay between what I said. Good. That was it. If you're watching the replay of this webinar, you can post questions and they will be added to the chat later. If I can, I will reply by email. So if you're watching the replay and that happens, it's not live, you can still ask questions and they will be answered either via email or in the chat if and when I'm live. Good. Thanks for joining us. Maybe our next advanced webinar will be on developing great concepts. Who knows? Thank you for participating today, and I hope you'll join us next time again. See you either in Canberra, on Facebook, or in the fishbowl.